who would be part creature of the Vandals and part creature of Constantinople. Plus, Olybrius' legitimacy was going to flow from his marriage to Placidia, rather than from the patronage of Ricimer. So in Ricimer's mind, I doubt there was a worse candidate for the throne than Olybrius. Genseric stepped up the pressure by intensifying Vandal raids on the Italian coast, promising to shut them down only if Olybrius was elevated, but Ricimer refused to budge. After a 3-month interregnum, Ricimer finally found a candidate more to his liking. Someone dull, weak-willed, and entirely dependent on Ricimer. Enter Libius Severus. Dull, weak-willed, entirely dependent on Ricimer, Libius Severus. We know almost nothing about the new would-be emperor until he suddenly appears in Ravenna accepting the diadem in November of 461. Not that it really matters. Libius Severus is not exactly the linchpin of Roman history. During the reign of Majorian, Ricimer may have fancied himself the power behind the throne, but it's pretty clear that Majorian himself, and a good number of other people, considered it to be more of a partnership. With the elevation of Severus, though, this ambiguity was gone. Ricimer was the power behind the throne. These are the years where you have references to King Ricimer. Not references mocking his hubris, mind you, but just straight-up references to King Ricimer, because that's basically what he now was. As I mentioned a few episodes back, the famous historian J.B. Barrie once said that Ricimer was the link between Stilicho and Odoacer, and was the first German to be virtual king of Italy. Now, 15 years down the road, we're going to have a real German king of Italy, and the pro forma nature of Odoacer's seizure of power finds its roots here in the days of Ricimer, who, during these years, went so far as to possibly coin money in his own name. We're not 100% sure that he coined money in his own name, but there are good reasons to believe that he did. And I think it's telling that if it turns out to be true, no one is going to be surprised in the slightest. The elevation of Severus was, of course, only really recognized in Italy, and so King Ricimer's power did not really extend that far. Up in Gaul, Aegidius was essentially in revolt, as was Marcellinus in Dalmatia. The Eastern Augustus Leo, for his part, never recognized Severus, though, for the moment, he was not looking to make or break relations with the West over the issue of Majorian's murder and Severus's elevation. Now, Marcellinus was apparently prepared to storm Italy as soon as the spring of 462 arrived and asked for Leo's support, but the Eastern Emperor refused to give it, instead counseling patience. With backing, Marcellinus took the council and sat on his hands, but he was done taking orders from Ricimer. The de facto king's first concern, though, was the situation in Gaul. If he tried to attack Marcellinus first, he might incur the wrath of Leo, so better to settle the north before worrying about the east. But if he wanted to maintain his iron grip on Italy, Ricimer knew he couldn't go marching off to retake Gaul himself. He needed to find a capable subordinate to do the job for him. Now, he couldn't send the quote-unquote Emperor Severus. Not only was he likely thoroughly inexperienced in military affairs, but sending an emperor off to win back Gaul had almost certainly been one of the keys to the breakdown in the relationship between Majorian and Ricimer. Majorian had been starting to forge an independent power base for himself, and we can't have that. Better to find some suitably motivated underling and send him off to get the job done. Ricimer had the perfect candidate in an old soldier named Agrippinus. What recommended Agrippinus for the job? Well, for starters, he had been Avitus's Magister Militum for Gaul, which meant that he was the one who had been replaced by Aegidius when Majorian came to power. But the fun did not stop there. A native of Gaul himself, Agrippinus had not gone quietly into that good night, nor had Aegidius given him any reason to. Eventually, the feud between the two men led Aegidius to accuse Agrippinus of treason. Sent down to Rome to stand for his crime, Agrippinus was found guilty and sentenced to death. He managed to escape his captivity, however, and then seek asylum in the old St. Peter's, where he remained until he was officially pardoned. The details of all this are, of course, really vague, but the assumption is that the official pardon came after the death of Majorian, round about the time Ricimer was looking for someone to lead the effort to repacify Gaul and defeat the rebel Aegidius. And what better man to lead that effort than Agrippinus, who had lost his job and then very nearly lost his life to Aegidius. When Agrippinus reached Gaul sometime in 462, he did exactly the same thing Majorian had done when he entered Gaul back in 458. He made a beeline for the Goths. But unlike Majorian, who was looking to defeat and repacify the Goths, Agrippinus was looking to befriend and re-empower them. And when he arrived in Aquitaine, he found the Goths very receptive to the imperial proposals, because said proposals promised the Goths something they had been hankering for since they first put down roots in Gaul, a Mediterranean port to call their very own. In exchange for Goth support in a campaign against Aegidius, the quote-unquote Emperor Severus was willing to cede them the city of Narbonne. The Goth king Theodoric II jumped at this offer. All those battles between his father, Theodoric the Elder, and Aetius back in the day had been all about trying to win a Mediterranean port for the Goths. And now the Romans were just going to hand one over in exchange for what? Beating down a few rebels? Well, sign us up. We'll be there. But Aegidius was not leading some ramshackle band of ne'er-do-wells. You'll recall that, as I just mentioned, the little rump state Aegidius founded was going to outlast the Western Empire. Well, if it's going to outlast the Western Empire, there isn't really room in the story for a crushing defeat at the hands of Agrippinus and the Goths. I mean, maybe there is, but that would become a pretty complicated story. Lucky for us, they decided to keep things nice and simple. Agrippinus and a Goth army marched north. Aegidius heard they were coming and drew his line at Orleans. The two sides met in battle at some point in late 462, and Aegidius emerged victorious. Agrippinus and the Goths then fled, and though I have no idea what ultimately happened to him, that's the last we're going to hear from Agrippinus. Whether he died in the battle or simply faded into obscurity, no idea. He just drops off the face of the earth. This nice and simple story is only complicated by one small matter. Aegidius had not been idle since the death of Majorian, nor was he blind to the fact that pretty soon Ricimer would be coming for him. So he made a sort of mutual defense pact with the Franks. This pact obviously came into force when the Goths started marching north, and though Frankish support was likely the difference between victory and defeat for Aegidius, it was also likely the difference between victory and total victory. It seems that once they had the Goths on the run, the various Frank nobles fell into squabbling amongst themselves about who knows what, shutting down any chance Aegidius had of really crushing the Goths once and for all. Had the Franks held it together, it is possible that Aegidius could have made what was left of the Goths into his personal vassals. Then, between his alliance with the Franks, his mastery over the Goths, and his control over the rest of Gaul, well, he might well have marched into Italy and overthrown Ricimer. Get Marcellinus on board with that plan, you invade Italy from the east while I invade from the north, and Ricimer and his quote-unquote emperor don't stand a chance. But instead, Aegidius' army got vapor-locked at Orleans, and though Aegidius would never lose his domain in northern Gaul, neither would he ever expand it. While this drama was unfolding in the north, Ricimer was kept busy by Genseric and the Vandals, who were not taking his failure to elevate Olybrius lightly. Throughout 462 and then into 463 and 464 and 465, the Vandals continued to harass the Italian coastline, hitting and running and staying and moving up here and then here again. The new fleet built by Majorian was maybe somewhat effective, but it clearly wasn't the silver bullet the Romans were looking for to shut down the Vandals. Plus, Genseric was now moving forward with an ever more ambitious political program. Above and beyond his stated goal that Olybrius ought to be Emperor of the West, Genseric now began to make very Attila the Hun-esque claims on Roman property. After all, his son Hunric had married Eudoxia the Younger, so wasn't he entitled to some kind of dowry? Now, Genseric was not so bold as to demand half the Western Empire as Attila had, but he did claim a good chunk of the personal fortune controlled by the emperors, which, he further claimed, had been stolen by Ricimer and his ilk. That fortune belonged to the imperial women under his charge, or at the very least, their husbands, not a bunch of thugs who murdered Valentinian III. That Ricimer didn't have anything to do with Valentinian's death was immaterial. The Theodosian family fortune belonged to the Theodosian family. It was just that simple. Now, these sorts of legalistic arguments fell on deaf ears in the West. It's not like Ricimer was going to just hand over the imperial fortune to Genseric and the exiled princesses. So it seems reasonable to assume that these arguments were mostly directed at Constantinople. Genseric was well aware of the fact that Leo was not recognizing the legitimacy of Severus, which meant that there would probably, eventually, be some sort of effort to remove him. When that day came, Genseric wanted to make sure that his own demands were on record. Plus, he wanted to make it super obvious to everyone what the price for his help in any push to dislodge Ricimer and Severus was going to be. But Leo was in no hurry to go to war with Ricimer, even if Italy was increasingly politically, economically, and militarily isolated. So the simmering tensions of the early 460s hit a nice equilibrium. Skirmishing, jockeying, and maneuvering amongst the fractured power centers of the West ruled the day, with no one really taking anyone else down or suddenly grabbing up more territory. Even the death of Aegidius in 464 did not disrupt things too much. Whether he died naturally or was poisoned by enemies within the Frankish kingdom is unknown. Both stories are reported, but everyone reports that he was simply succeeded by his son, who continued the independent rule of his father, and who would continue this independent rule until he and what was left of his little Roman kingdom were overrun by the Franks in 486. This new equilibrium further survived an even more potentially transformative death in 465. During that summer, the quote-unquote Emperor Severus apparently died of natural causes. There is some dark hinting that Ricimer did him in, but there's little reason to believe this story. We have no idea how old Severus was when he died, but he was allowed to call himself emperor for 4 years. His death would